I'm Alison. Welcome to this film all about painting contemporary Christmas cards. I'm going to take you through a series of projects, right from beginners, sharing some tips and tricks with you, up to advanced. Shall we get started with our first project? So our first project is going to be painting a winter tree, and I'm going to share with you some nice basic watercolour skills. In front of me I've got a greetings card ready-made that's made out of Bockingford watercolour paper, and I'm just going to do a couple of things to it first before we start painting. So the first thing I've got here is some framers tape, which I've actually already stuck to myself to make it a little less sticky, and I'm going to put that down the crease of the card, so it just makes sure that I know where one side of the card starts and the other side of the card stops, and it just masks it off in case my brush happens to tip over the edge. You may decide that you quite like that effect, but I like a nice crisp white line. I'm going to use a pencil, and about a third of the way down my card I'm just going to draw a sort of hill horizon line, but very lightly. So I'm going to start over here, just draw in a nice random line that I can just about see, and I'm happy with that. I'm happy with where it is positioned. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put a wash in the background to suggest either a sky or some trees that are going on in the wood beyond. So I've got my number 10 brush, and I'm going to mix up two washes, one which is cobalt blue, so a nice crisp sharp blue, so quite a washy version of that, making sure I've got plenty of water in there, just a little bit more paint. And then the other colour that we're going to use today is going to be Potter's Green, a really nice cold green that granulates really beautifully on the paper and creates some nice textural marks. So I'm going to wash my brush out, and then straight onto the card I'm going to just put a little bit of water down so that when my paint hits it, it will disperse the colour and should create a nice fuzzy shape in the background. So straight in with the blue into there, and you can see straight away how that water down on the surface creates that lovely misty effect. I'm not going to bother washing my brush out in between, straight into the Potter's Green and popping that down. Now you can see there I don't have to worry about my edge because I either go off the card in one direction or the masking tape is helping me on the other side. So just going to work that up to that line that I drew in pencil. Happy with that. I'm going to take my scrunched up piece of kitchen roll and I'm just going to very lightly rag roll back into that very carefully. I don't want to take all the paint off that I've already put on, but I do want to create a nice soft shape in the background. Now I need to let that dry, but it is worth pointing out that if you want your cards to dry naturally, you can just leave them slightly weighted down. Or if you're going to use a hairdryer, it's worth remembering to make sure that your cards dry nice and flat. You want to dry it from the front, but also from the back, so that the paper's given a chance to stretch back out again. So I'm going to do that, and when we come back I'm going to show you a tip with some more of the framers tape. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a tree right in the foreground of my card, and I'm going to do that with quite a nice little trick that I'm going to share with you. So here I've got a piece of framers tape which I'm going to use to create the trunk of the tree, and I'm going to tear it in half. Now this is a little bit fiddly, so it's worth taking some time over and just guide it with your fingers so that it doesn't go off to one side. If it does all get stuck up, you can always anchor that bit down to carry on tearing, which is sometimes a little bit more helpful. So I'm going to tear it all the way down to the bottom. Don't worry about it being uneven. That's the point of the exercise. You'll see why in just a second. So I've got to the bottom. There we go. There's my two bits of masking tape. So I'll just put one to one side, straighten my card up, and then pop this one in. So just on the left-hand side, I'm going to put that bit of tape down. Take my other piece of tape, and then I'm going to leave a gap in between, and you can see straight away how the trunk of my tree is going to occur. There it is in the gap just there. Now to make sure that the paint doesn't leak under the tape, I'm going to use a burnisher. Just very lightly. You don't want to press too hard, otherwise you might have trouble getting it off later, but just run the burnisher down that edge so there's no danger of the paint leaking underneath. Now, as you can see, some of my background is now visible where the trunk of my tree is going to be, and that might get in the way of my paint. So to stop that happening, I'm going to take it out with a magic sponge. So I'm going to dip the magic sponge into the water, just the corner of it. Don't want to make it too wet, it just needs to be damp. And I'm going to use the magic sponge just to take out that element of colour. And because I've used nice pale colours, it lifts off really easily. And then I'm going to use my kitchen roll to blot off that excess moisture. I'm not going to rub it because you might damage the surface of the card, but I'm just going to lift out any of that moisture that the magic sponge put down. And now I can paint the trunk of my tree. So to do that, I'm going to use a flat brush so that I can create the texture of what will hopefully look like a birch tree. So into the water, I'm just going to have that piece of kitchen roll in my other hand. I'm going to start with the blue. Now this time you can make a nice strong colour because you want it to stand out in the foreground. So a little bit of blue onto the brush, and then I'm going to just put the kitchen roll on the base of the brush, not on the tip, just on the base. And you'll start to see that as I press it down, the brush has still got colour on it, but it turns into this lovely kind of serrated finish. And I'm going to use that by wiggling it down one side of my tree and pulling the colour along. Then if I fancy a different colour, so I'm going to go into the green now. Now my brush is quite dry, but you still might just need to keep an eye on it to pull that colour across. So add a little bit of green, a bit of the wiggle over the top, and you can do this quite quickly. So if you've got a lot of cards to make, or you want to make multiples, this is something that you can set up. So a little bit more moisture, a little bit more green, and this time I'm going to add a touch of black into that mix as well. You won't need very much of the black, but I'm going to create a greeny grey. So back onto my kitchen roll it goes, wiggling it. Now I've got some really lovely dark shadows down towards the bottom. I'm just going to put a few of those a bit further up. You can always use your kitchen roll to just lift off any areas that you're unhappy with. That's it, I quite like my tree. Now, I need to take the tape off in order to put the branches in. And if you've burnished it down too much, there is a danger that you pull the surface of the card away. So this is the bit that needs to be done very carefully. And I would suggest that as you pull the tape off, you pull the tape towards the tree. That way, if it does rip for any reason, you can always burnish it back down and paint part of the trunk back in. If you pull it the other way, the danger is that you pull the surface off into your background, which you don't really want. So I'm pulling that towards my tree. I can feel underneath that there's a little bit of resistance, but it's coming off okay because I didn't burnish it down too hard. And there we have the trunk of the tree, nice and easy. So now I'm going to add some branches. If you're not very confident with putting branches in, you could always draw them in pencil first if you felt more comfortable with that. Or you can use a rigger straight away, which is what I'm going to do. Same colours as before. So we're going to pick up a little bit of the cobalt blue, add some water into it, and then we're going to use the rigger holding it a little bit further up the handle. Pick a spot where we want our branches to start, and we're going to wiggle it along, twisting it as we go, and then flicking the end. Now I can go back into the same colour, or I can pick a different colour, so I get a nice variation. I'm going to start in the same place, wiggling it along, twisting it as I go, and then flicking the end. So a little bit more colour, back onto the brush. These ones I think I feel like starting a bit lower down. So wiggling it, twisting it, flicking it. And here I can start blending it into my tree. My kitchen roll can be there to mop up any excess. So a little bit more green this time. Wiggling it, twisting it along, and then flicking it at the end. I can have some more grey versions as well if I fancy. And I can start to build on those ones that I've already done by just adding a few more. It's very tempting when you get used to this technique to put lots in, but I would suggest that less is more and you just put a few in to suggest those branches. The rigger's the perfect brush to be doing that with. So there we have the branches on my winter tree, and just to finish it off I'm going to add just a few spatters to suggest any foliage that might be on there. but you don't want to ruin the back of your card. So I'm going to take a piece of kitchen roll and just lay it over that side. Then it's not going to spatter into the nice clean area on the back. And I'm going to take my number 10 brush that I used before. Let's start off with the blue again, mixing up a wash. I've got a little bit of black in there as well, but that's fine. Take my pencil and I'm going to tap one over the other, just to create some foliage. Now you could leave them as dots like that, or you can take a spray bottle and just very lightly spritz over the top of them, just to spread them out a little, and then hopefully they'll look a bit more like foliage. So into the green. I think I'll use the green on its own this time rather than mixing it with anything, because this is such a beautiful colour. Tapping it over the top. This time, of course, it will be going onto both dry paper and wet paper where you've spritzed it, but that should create a really lovely diffused look. And then lastly, let's put a little bit of the black in with that green to create that lovely grey again, and pop that over the top. You can put it wherever you like. You can put little bits further down if you prefer. And then you can use your kitchen roll just to blot off any excess that you may have. So let's just lift a few of those areas out. And there you can see straight away, you've got a lovely clean area on the back, and there's your foliage in there already. I'm not going to take the tape off of this because it's still a bit wet. And as before, you want to be taking tape off when it's nice and dry so that you don't rip the back. But there is our first project, a nice and simple winter tree. So let's start our second project. We're going to stick with the tree theme, but we're going to make it a little bit more Christmassy now, and a little bit of sparkle at the end of this demonstration. Now this one is a progression from the last one, so a few watercolour techniques, but the most important part about this project is the preparation. So we're going to start with masking tape as we did before. This time I'm going to use my masking tape to give my card a border. So I'm going to stick the masking tape down just over the edge of each side of my card, so that that lovely decal finish, which is cut out on the edge, will show up even more by the time I've finished. You can also use this as an excuse to anchor your card down to your drawing board if you wanted to. So there's the top and the bottom, and I'm going to do this side, and I'm going to just burnish those down again very lightly, just so that my colour doesn't creep under. So just a quick pass over on each side. Now you may have noticed straight away that I've left this side, and there's a really good reason for that. I'm going to take this piece of tape and I'm going to look to see where the line of the crease is. I'm going to come just inside of that. So it's a little bit tricky to line up, but take your time because it's worth it. Now one edge I'm going to keep lifted up as I burnish this side down. And this burnishing tool is a wonderful way of getting it down nice and crisp. And then on this side, I'm going to take a piece of kitchen roll and tuck the kitchen roll underneath there, because we're going to be using Brush-O. And if you've used Brush-O before, you'll know it goes everywhere. So I'm going to make sure my card is nice and clean. So there we have my painting area. And here I've got two further bits of kitchen roll that I have torn in half. So they've got nice irregular edges, and we're going to use that to mask out our tree. So I'm going to lay this one down in one diagonal, and I'm going to make sure that I've got the torn side and use it as a diagonal that way. So you can start to see how the shape of the Christmas tree is formed. You can just give it a lift and check that it's in the right place. If you're not very confident, of course, you could just put a very faint triangle down in pencil if you wanted to, but I'm going to try and go for it with my kitchen roll today. In these two pots, I have got Prussian blue, Brush-O powder, and I've got sea green, which is hopefully going to be my Christmas tree green. And they're in the sprinkle pots with the sides exposed with the small holes in them so that I can sprinkle it from on high. Now you don't need very much of this, so I'm just going to give it a light tap. You can see how much goes down, and get hold of the sea green and pop that in as well. You do tend to find with Brush-O that they are different size particles, and it's worth remembering with that. Some come out quite large, some are quite fine. And then I have a spray bottle just with water in it, and making sure that the spray bottle is far away from my surface, not up close. If you spray it up close, it will literally push all the colour away and you'll end up with a big puddle. Whereas if you do it from on high and you spray nice and fine, then you can see straight away what's happening. That sea green and the Prussian blue are mixing together, and my kitchen roll is acting as a barrier. I'm going to take that kitchen roll away immediately, nice and carefully, and there we have the Christmas tree shape. And while that brusho is still a bit wet, I'm going to take my brush and just pull some of the colour in to the centre a little bit more. So you've got areas which are very textured, and then you've got areas that look a little bit more like watercolour. Try really hard to not obliterate all of that lovely white space that you've got left behind, and I'm just controlling the amount of liquid on my brush by tapping it on the kitchen roll, pulling it down, so I've got some different areas. You could of course use kitchen roll to blot it out if you wanted to. Then I'm going to get to the bottom of my tree, a little bit more, and I'm going to blend some of this out so that it looks like my tree is sitting on the ground rather than floating in midair. In fact, I am going to use one of these bits of kitchen roll, scrunched up, to just pull some of that colour out. And you will see straight away that the combination of the sea green and the Prussian blue acts like a shadow for the tree to sit on. Let's feed a little bit of that colour back up into the tree, just so that it looks a little more solid. And we'll peter this out over here. A little bit more water, and a little bit more blotting out with our kitchen roll. A really handy tip is if you want to just target a small area, wind your kitchen roll into a point and then just tap it into that area, and you'll find it will suck up all the excess moisture without you having to interfere with it too much. Now I need to let that dry before I can carry on to the next step. So I'm going to let it dry naturally as before, or if you need to use a hairdryer, exactly like I said before, make sure it's dried from both the back and the front. But when we come back, I'll show you how to add a background. So now that's dry, I'm going to put a background in. And you may wonder why I've changed the order, because normally you would do a background first. But I want to make the edges of my tree nice and soft, and it's also to prove that you don't have to do things in the same order all of the time. So one thing I've got to take care of before I do anything is that there's some little bits of brusho that have crept their way underneath the kitchen roll. So I'm just going to use a dry brush to just very lightly flick those away. Don't worry too much if they make a mark, it's not the end of the world, but it's just so that you can keep a bit of control over the edges of your tree. So now that that's taken care of, I'm going to choose a nice cold blue, so that cobalt blue that I used before, mixing it up into a nice wash and laying it down straight onto the card, not worrying about it too much, using some water to blend it out so that I get some paler areas and some darker areas. I'm going to work around the top first and being very aware of the edges of my tree. So as soon as I get to that point at the edge of my tree, I'm going to use the brush slightly differently and dot that cobalt blue in towards the edge. And you can see what happens straight away. The brusho starts to bleed out into it, which I think is a rather lovely effect. I'm going to add to that in a minute. So a little bit more water and a little bit more colour, making my way down to the bottom. If you pick up some brusho, don't worry, just blend it in. And you can also use your kitchen roll, like we did before, just to pick up any areas of colour if you're not happy with them. So let's work on the other side, which is a little bit harder to do if you're right-handed. But let's use some water, blend that out into the edges of my tree, and you can see already how it's diffusing really nicely. Pulling that colour down, lifting anything out that I don't like the look of, like that bit in there. Pulling down that colour, and actually some of my brushes mixing into it, which is what we call a happy accident, because I really like that effect. Little bit of rag roll around the edge. And then here in my palette, I've got some Prussian blue and some sea green in powder form, which I'm going to mix up with a little bit of water, and I'm going to go back into my tree to add. And you can see that you get a nice soft diffusion. And I'm also going to start adding another layer to darken up the core of my tree so that it looks a little bit more solid. Let's go for the sea green this time. So picking up a bit of colour, dropping that in, waiting for it to blend out into that lovely cobalt blue that I've put in the background. And you can see it just adds another dimension to your work, which wasn't there previously. I'm still trying very hard to leave some texture, but just working my way down either side, a little bit more on the right hand side, I think. It also gives you another way that you can use Brusho. You don't have to just use it in its powdered form. You can make it up into a type of ink as well, and it's a lovely strong colour. So I'm going to work my way down this side, back into the sea green. That's great, that's exactly what I want it to do, create a nice soft edge. Now once again, when I get to the bottom of this area, I'm going to need to let it dry again before I add those final touches. So let's just work our way down here. And I'm pretty happy with that, I have to say. A few little more, trying very hard not to fill in all the white gaps. And it's going to be ready for that final flourish in a minute. So let's let that dry, and then when we come back, we're going to add some glitter. So I'm just going to add a few final flourishes to this card, and I'm going to start with adding a little bit more Brusho. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wet some lines on my Christmas tree with a tiny touch of water. Not too much, you won't need too much at all, just in some areas so that you can pop your brush into some brilliant red Brusho and then add that back in. It's just going to act as a bit of a colour underneath some glitter, which we're going to add in a minute. So back into the Brusho, touching back over. You'll find that in some areas where you're painting over the white, the red will show up, and in other areas it won't, but it will just add a nice solid background to our tree. You could even add, as I'm going to do, a tiny little bit at the top as well. Let's give the top of our Christmas tree a bit of a flourish. So there's the red, and then into that, while it's still wet, you don't need to let it dry, I'm just going to add a little bit of Bindex. So the Bindex is going to act like a glue for our glitter. You could drop the glitter straight into the wet Brusho, but the chances are that it wouldn't stay there. And if you're going to send this as a Christmas card, you don't want it all coming off in the envelope. So a little bit of Bindex into that wet area at the top, and a little bit more at the bottom. But you can embellish this as however you like. So you could put fairy lights down, you could use all different colours of glitter. This is just one idea to get you started. So a little bit more Bindex down in there. And actually the Bindex is mixing with the Brusho and producing a rather nice effect. And then I'm going to use a dry brush. You could tap the glitter over the surface if you wanted to and then tap it off. But I'm going to use a dry brush into the glitter. Let's just use my finger to tap that off. And this glitter is beautifully fine, so it's not going to look too large against the backdrop of your Christmas tree. And a little bit over the bottom as well. Don't worry if it spills everywhere. By the time the glue has set, you can just brush it off or tap it off into the bin. So a little bit of glitter down there and a little bit at the top. And that just adds another dimension to your card. But you can go to town on it however you like to decorate your Christmas trees. So I'm going to pop that down, and then just the last thing I'm going to show you is very carefully removing the masking tape. Now this time I'm going to pull the tape away from my picture. With the trees that we did in the first project, we pulled the tape towards, but this time I'm going to pull away just in case it tears. And then it will tear into the white areas rather than back into the colour. So let's do this bottom one, and you can see that I'm tearing it at 90 degrees, which makes it a little bit easier to remove, holding down the card at the same time so it doesn't crease. And then if for any reason at all, like I have here, you get a slight scuff mark, you can go back in with your burnisher and just put the surface of the paper back down again. But there we have my completed Brusho Christmas tree. For this next card project, I'm going to be using a premium mount kit, And if you have a look at the menu of this DVD, you'll see a bonus feature where I describe how to put it together. But for the time being, I'm just going to be using this part of it, which is the piece of watercolour paper that comes with it. And I'm going to be doing a painting of some baubles. Now I have already cut out 3 circles of decoupage paper. You can see it's got this nice crinkle effect. And the first thing I'm going to do is stick them down. So I'm going to use the Bindex again. I find that Bindex is a really good glue for doing collage because it dries nice and quickly. So I'm going to just use an old brush to coat the back, making sure I get all of the edges of the decoupage paper, pop it down onto the surface, and then to make sure that it's really stuck down, I'm going to be giving it a coat over the top that goes just over the edge. So you're sealing it in a little bit of a sandwich. So I'm going to repeat that process for the others. Pick up the Bindex, lay it down on the back, making sure that you go over all of the area, flip it over, stick it down to the surface, and you can see that it starts to fight back a little bit, but you can persuade it down. Pop the Bindex over the top and then literally just over the edge so that it creates that nice sandwich of glue and paper. Last one going in, same thing, Bindex right up to the edge and then flip it over, down onto my surface, pushing it down with my fingers and then using the glue that's left over on the brush. You won't need very much at all, just over the edge, and then you can see that the decoupage paper stays nice and flat and it isn't going to wrinkle on you. That's a good tip for any collage techniques that you're using in your work. Now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to give these baubles a little bit of solidity. So I'm going to put a casing at the top of each one, which I'm just going to very lightly sketch in with this waterproof pen and put a little bit of shadow in on one side. There's one. Let's put the other one up here at the top. A little bit of shadow on one side. And then let's have this one down here. We'll line up over the top and then a little bit of shadow. And then they need something to hang from. So I'm going to use my ruler just to draw some lines in, nice and straight, but I'm not going to make the lines solid. I'm going to do a few little dots and dashes so that they don't look so solid. A little dot and then coming down to the casing. And then this one is actually going to be behind the others. So we'll pop that in there, make sure that the line is vertical, coming down all the way behind that bauble, all the way to the side of this one. And then you've got some nice soft lines and you can see that the baubles are hanging there just fine. Now to colour those in, because Bindex finishes with a slightly waterproof film, we're going to be using FW inks, so acrylic inks, to go over the top. And they come in some beautiful pearlescent colours. So the first one I'm going to use is Autumn Gold. And I'm going to put it down on the left-hand side of the bauble, right over the top of this decoupage finish, so that it adds to it. You could always let your Bindex dry in between, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to crack on with it and get all the colour down. So there's the first one. The second one we're going to go for is this beautiful macaw green, really gorgeous bright greeny colour. Putting that in all the way round, washing out my brush and then just using a little bit of water to blend that out. And then last we're going for the Sundown Magenta, this lovely pink colour. And what they also do is give your baubles a really lovely sheen to them, so they look like they're glistening in the light. Wash out my brush, then use a tiny bit of water just to blend that colour out. There we go, there's the 3. And if you wanted to add a little bit of shadow, you could always add a little bit of the Payne's Grey FW ink just at the bottom, blend it out just to make them look a little more solid, which I'm going to do to all 3 of mine. So there we go, a little bit of ink down. These inks are so versatile because they'll go on so many different surfaces. And we're going to just blend that out into the green. There we go, that's better. And then a little bit more down in here, just to make them look a little more 3-dimensional. Now, as I'm finishing this one, I'm going to need to let these dry before we put a background in, and we're going to give our background a little bit of pizzazz, but you're going to see that after I've let these 3 circles dry really thoroughly. I thought I'd share with you just a really quick, simple technique for putting a background in. And for this, I'm going to put my piece of paper over the top of a piece of kitchen roll, and I'm going to grate some of the Derwent Inktense sticks into the background. So I'm going to start off with a mustard colour and this lovely little grater. You don't need to press very hard, just very light spritzing over the top. And then we'll go for the field green. So you notice as well that I'm putting the colour next to the bauble of the similar tone. And then we'll go for the fuchsia at the bottom. So just a tiny little bit. I'm hardly pressing on this grater at all. These graters are brilliant just for creating that added bit of dynamism to your pictures. And we're going to also put Payne's Grey, so they're exactly the same colour as we used in the FW ink. And this time I'm just going to add it, if I can, just over the bottom of the baubles. So just a tiny bit on, and then I'm going to use a spray bottle just to activate that ink. So we'll give it a good spritz over the top, and there you can see immediately you've got this lovely dynamic background to what could be very plain subject. And of course I need to let that dry as well before we can finish them off. So let's finish off this card, and I'm going to finish it off with Inktense pencils, which I have matched to the colours that I used in the sticks. So this is the mustard, which I'm going to use on this casing. Just do a little bit of shading either side and add some on top of the FW ink too. We'll do it in the dry first and then we'll wet them all in a second. So there's the mustard. Let's go for the field green next. So a little bit of colour down on those casings, and then adding a little bit more around the sides. It might be difficult to see, but it's definitely there, and we'll just beef up those colours a little. And then we've got the fuchsia. So there's the fuchsia on either side of the casing, just leaving a gap in the middle to suggest the shine and a little bit more colour onto each. And then I've also got the Payne's Grey in a pencil form, so I can add to those shadows if I need to. So I'll do a little bit more on the yellow one, add a little bit more on the green, and then a little more on the pink. And then all that's left to do is to take a small wet brush with just a little bit of water. You don't need a lot of water, just to blend those colours into the surface of the card. So you can see how little water I'm using, and then use it on the coloured edge. Wash that out, swap over to the green. These silver brushes that I'm using have the most wonderful point on them, so I can really get into the fine detail of my subject. Wash that one out, and then just to finish off, the pink at the bottom. And on that side too. Slightly lost my highlight, but that's okay. I can go back, pull those out with kitchen roll. And then let's just finish off there. You can see that colour being merged in and the shadow at the bottom. So there we have our bauble Christmas card. And as I said at the beginning of this demonstration, if you pop over to the menu of the DVD, you'll see the bonus feature where I show you how to put it all together. This next project is going to be a holly wreath, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently. And it's for all of you that fancy combining watercolour, traditional watercolour techniques with some water-soluble pen. And although ultimately I'm going to mount it onto a watercolour card, I'm actually going to start the project on a piece of watercolour paper. So I have here a piece of Saunders Waterford rough, which I'm actually going to tear a shape out of. So the first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to fold the watercolour paper using the burnishing tool backwards and forwards just a couple of times to create a really strong crease. So I'll pass it backwards and forwards like that. That should be enough. And then I'm going to tear it. Now sometimes when you're tearing watercolour paper it can go off at a bit of an angle, so I'm going to use a steel rule to tear it against. So there we go. It does fight back a bit, but you can tear it and you can get a nice deckled edge, or a replica of a deckled edge. And then here I'm going to measure it against my card just to make sure that I've got the right size shape. Yes, I think that will do. Let's fold it about there and do the same technique again. I'm going to make sure it's square, burnish it down, folding it backwards and forwards to make sure I get a really nice crease, and then I can give it a good tear. Now, I've already got 2 decals on my piece of paper, those lovely torn edges that you get when you buy a sheet of Saunders Waterford. So I'm just adding to those. And there you've got a piece of watercolour paper that I'm going to be working with 4 lovely torn edges. If any of it sticks up, you can use your burnishing tool to go back over them and to just flatten it out before you start. So there's the piece of watercolour paper, and I'm just going to very roughly sketch out in pencil where I want my wreath shape to be. So it's going to be circular, but I'm not going to worry too much about it being a perfect circle. So we're coming around. It's going to have a centre, which is where all our shadows are going to occur. So that's going to be in there, and then I'm going to put a nice bright red bow on this wreath in this top corner. So using a very simple shape, we're not going to be too fussy about it at all. And it's going to be impressionistic, so don't worry too much about making it perfect. What I am going to concentrate on are the outside edges of this wreath shape, because if you've ever noticed a wreath, it has very broken lines, so I'm going to make sure that those show up. But rather than doing a lot of work in pencil, I'm going to switch to these Stabilo pens, which I know run really beautifully when they come in contact with water. So firstly, I'm going to start with this lovely bright green, just putting in some dots and dashes around the wreath, which when my wet brush meets them, the water will pick up the colour and it will make it blend, which is a really lovely instant technique. Actually, we'll put a few more of those in the middle. So those can be the lighter areas. Now I'm going to switch to a darker pine green, and I'm going to just concentrate a little bit on the shapes that holly makes. So there's lovely pointy style of drawing, just to suggest it. You don't have to draw it all in. In fact, it's a little easier if you're not too prescriptive with it. So there's my Stabilo going in. And then, of course, I mustn't forget the beautiful red bow. So here is the crimson version of the same pens. Could do a little bit more shading with it. And the folds in the ribbon, as you would see them if it was attached to the edge of your wreath. So those are going in, and I'm just going to vaguely suggest where the ends of those ribbons occur. And there we have the pen work all good to go. Now, alongside that, I'm going to start adding some watercolour to it. I'm not going to wet it first. The wet brush will pick up those colours as I work with the watercolour. So I'm using Daniel Smith watercolours. This is a rich green gold. So I'm just mixing it up into a little bit of a wash, and I'm just adding it very loosely over the top, and you can see straight away how the brush picks up that colour. Use a bit of my kitchen roll just to control the amount of water that's on the brush. So I'm thinking about the shape of the wreath. I'm thinking about using my brush lightly across the surface of the paper. I'm trying very hard to not fill in everything, to leave some gaps so that you can see through it. And I'm combining, picking up the Daniel Smith colour alongside adding water to the pen that's already there. And you can see very quickly how it all starts to take shape and starts to look like a wreath without you having to try too hard. So let's put a little bit more of that green gold in. And then we'll add a darker green to it as well. So I'm going to go for this deep sap green, which is a really rich fir pine kind of Christmassy colour. And both into the wet areas and onto some of the dry areas. Now I'm starting to pay attention to where the points of those holly leaves might occur. So sometimes you'll find that your brush hits a really wet area and it all blends together. And in other areas you'll find that it's dry and you can get that gorgeous wet into wet look, which is synonymous with watercolour. So a little bit more Where the bow is, I'm just going to drop a little bit of a shadow in there. So you can see it really starting to take shape now. Working nice and quickly, nice and loosely, all the way round our wreath shape. And like I said, you can see where I've paid very close attention to leaving some gaps so it doesn't look too solid. Working my way up to here, up into where that bow shape is and out to the edge. And then I'm going to need to let that dry, but just before I do that, I'm going to start adding some red into this bow. And for my choice of colour this time, I'm going for a quinacridone red, which is a lovely strong colour. So you don't need very much of it and you can blend it out. I'm not worrying too much about the shadows on my bow at the moment. Those will come in the next round of paint. But again, you can see I'm trying very hard not to paint it all in, to use my brush in a kind of scribbled manner, using just the tip of it, which I know is not the easiest thing to do, but that is one of the reasons that I like to paint fast. So sometimes it's worth giving yourself a bit of a time limit, especially if you're making your own Christmas cards, because you might want to do more than one of these. So let's just add a little bit more colour, and there the pink is bleeding into the green, but I actually quite like that effect. It gives it a more watercolour-y look. So I'm pleased with that, actually. I don't want to do any more to it, and I don't want to overpaint it or faff about with it. So I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to add some shadows to it when it's perfectly flat. So that's all dry now, and I'm going to add some shadows, both in the background, on the wreath itself, and then of course it wouldn't be a painting of mine without a little bit of a spatter at the end, but we'll get to that. So I am switching to some Lunar Black now, which is a really lovely soft black that I'm going to use in the background. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to my larger brush, so a size 10 brush for this, to make sure that I don't get too precise about it. So I'm going to put a shadow into the centre, so it looks like the wreath is actually sitting on a surface. Let's use some water just to blend that out, and use a little bit of kitchen roll just to soften that ever so slightly. I'm also going to put a little bit of shadow behind. This is a sort of nothing shadow really. It's just to take the edge off some of this extra white paper, and it adds to the three-dimensional qualities of your wreath and stops it looking like it's stuck on. But it really doesn't need to be too precise. You can just wash that colour in, as you can see. Let's just soften the edge of that a little bit. There we go, I'm happy with that. So I'm going to switch to my smaller brush to add some shadows back actually onto the wreath and the bow itself. So I'm mixing up a slightly thicker consistency now. Now the Lunar Black has a really lovely transparent quality to it. So it means that I can paint it over the red, and the pink of it is still going to show through. It's not going to kill off the colour. So I can put a shadow in the middle of that bow there, just where the fabric would be folded over. Again, you want to be quite loose and quite fast with it. Just using the kitchen roll for a bit of texture. And then a little bit more on the brush, just around where the centre of the bow is tied, to give it that three-dimensional quality and to make the centre of it really stand out. I'm pleased with that. So let's just take the edge off of that. And I think actually just a little bit more down here where it would be leading onto the tails of the bow. Now you can have a look at your paintings and assess where you think you need shadows or where you need highlights. You could add some more pen back in if you wanted to. I'm going to choose to add a little more green, just for a few more shapes on the top. Just using that brush in a scribbling fashion, and some water to blend it out. Real traditional watercolour techniques here. Being very careful to not paint in those lovely white spaces that I've reserved. So a little bit more. Let's make that shadow up against the bow nice and dark as well. So you're just adding another layer for interest. A little bit more on the other side, I think, and then I'm going to try really hard, practice what I preach, and to not poke it about too much. Wash off my brush, blend that colour out, perhaps a little bit more down here, certainly near the centre where the most dense foliage would be on a Christmas wreath. And then we're going to add some speckling, just to give it some texture. So the first thing I'm going to do is to put it on top a piece of kitchen roll, just to control the spatter, and we're going to use a speckling brush. Speckling brushes are brilliant for getting fine spatter over your surface, rather than a toothbrush, which can give you very big blobs if you're not careful. So the way that I like to use these is to take the brush that you would normally use for putting your colour down, mixing up a thick wash, and actually poking it into the centre of the speckling brush, giving it a bit of a turn every time. And then when it's full of colour, you can see this pin. You put the pin into the brush, and you must remember to have pin down, otherwise you end up with green freckles. And then just over the surface, I'm going to pass just a couple of turns, and you can see very fine texture. Just gives your card that extra dimension. And of course you could do it in white gouache or anything really that you feel is appropriate to finish off your painting. But that's mine all done. Now again, with the bonus feature, you will see me put this card back together again, and I'll give it some wash lines as well. So there's lots to see on that extra bonus feature in the main menu. So for our final project, I thought we'd step it up a gear just a little bit and incorporate lots of different techniques into this greetings card. So I've got a few things to show you first. Here I've got a piece of watercolour paper which I've actually prepared so that eventually I can make my own greetings card out of it, and we'll talk more about that in the bonus feature if you want to pop back to the main menu. But I've got a piece of A5 size watercolour paper with just a little bit added on for a hinge, which is the bit that I'm going to use to stick it down later. Here is my subject matter that I'm going to be doing, which is a robin, which I thought was nice and festive and a nice bright animal to be doing on our card. But I want to incorporate some collage materials. Now, you could incorporate anything that you felt was appropriate, but I thought I would make my own collage materials for this one. So I've taken a piece of tissue paper, just ordinary tissue paper. You could go for a pattern or plain, whatever you prefer. You could write on it to make your collage pattern, which I'm going to explain in a second. You could even take a Christmas carol and print it out onto ordinary printer paper. This Christmas carol is in the bleak midwinter, which is one of my favourites, and I've double checked to make sure that it's in the public domain. So it means that it's copyright free, and that means I can use the lyrics on a piece of paper without having to worry about copyright issues. But I thought I would step it up a little bit further, and I've made my own collage papers. And the way that I've done that is I've taken a piece of tissue paper and cut it roughly to the size of an A4 sheet. I have used some mount spray to spray the piece of copy paper, not the tissue, the copy paper. I've let that dry, and then I've stuck the plain piece of tissue down onto it. I've used a word processing program within my computer, and I've got a printer that's got a back feed. So I've fed the piece of paper into the back, and it has printed out onto it. It bleeds a little bit, but I quite like that effect. It then means that you can peel that piece of tissue off and you can use it for your collage. So here I have my piece of collage paper right here. Now you can see it's on the tissue paper and it's all printed out ready to go. So this is my first point. I'm going to take the tissue paper and I'm going to tear strips of it off. We'll worry about what size and shape they are in a second. So this means you can choose little bits of lyric that you prefer or that are your favourite carol, as long as you check that it's in the public domain first. So I'm tearing it into a shape. Here I've got a rather nice lyric that said, "Snow had fallen, snow on snow," which I think is very appropriate for our robin. And I'm placing them onto the watercolour paper just to decide where I need them to go for the composition. So as before, I'm going to use some Bindex with an old brush underneath where I want my collage papers to go. So a little bit of Bindex down, and then the tissue paper into that glue, and then the Bindex over the top. Now you do have to be a little bit careful with Bindex and inkjet, because sometimes it can make it run, but with what we're going to do to it, you're not going to notice that, I promise. A little bit more water, wet the brush, pop it straight into the Bindex. So some Bindex going down onto my watercolour paper. There goes my bit of collage, and brush the Bindex over the top. And this means, just like we did on the bauble project, that your collage materials are going to go down nice and flat and they're not going to wrinkle up. Now you could wait for that to dry, or you could do the next step, which I'm about to do, which is to use some watercolour ground. Now watercolour ground is a real favourite of mine, and I like to use it with collage to push the collage papers back into the surface. So as you can see at the moment, they're really standing proud and they would stand out too much and possibly argue with my subject matter. So I'm going to use the watercolour ground on the back of a palette knife. This is the titanium white watercolour ground, and I'm just going to coat the back of the palette knife, and I'm going to drag that over the surface of where the collage meets the watercolour paper. So you can see straight away how all of a sudden the edges of my collage paper start to disappear, and it adds a rather nice texture. In fact, I'm also going to add it into the background so that it isn't just where my collage materials are, that it's providing a source of interest for the texture elsewhere on my picture as well. Now it also means that you can edit out some of the lyrics. So if you don't like a particular phrase or word, you can put the watercolour ground over the top, or if you put it over the top and you think, actually, I quite like that word, you can scrape it back and it will start to show through. So I've done that top piece. Now I'm going to do this bottom piece. So just quite a light, thin layer, and using the back of the palette knife means that you skim over the surface and create a rather lovely texture. So there we go, it actually says "In the Bleak Midwinter" down there. It's a favourite carol of my grandmother, so I'm happy to be using it today. A little bit more on the back of my palette knife up to the top, and there we have our collage papers down nice and tight on the surface and the watercolour ground over the top. Now it's really important that that dries thoroughly, so I'm going to let it dry and then we're going to come back and look at ways that we can transfer our robin onto the surface. So the watercolour ground is now completely dry, and it's really important that you leave it so that it's dry all the way through. If it's just dry on the surface, when you come to do the next bit, you'll find that it makes a dent in it and you really don't want to damage any of the tools that you're working with. So it's completely dry and nice and hard. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to transfer my robin onto this piece of paper. You could draw it out freehand if you wanted to. I'm going to use trace down. So this was the robin that we had in a photograph, and this is a copyright-free image. And I've actually flipped it round on the computer because I thought it was a little bit odd that the robin was facing into the card and I wanted him facing out. So I have copied it out exactly the right size. So I'm just going to tape that down to my piece of watercolour paper, and I should be able to just flip the tape around. We'll put the photograph to one side and we'll use trace down in order to do it. So slip the trace down underneath, making sure that it's dark side down, otherwise it won't transfer. So let's slip the trace down underneath there, and I'm going to use a biro in order to make the transfer because it just pushes through a little harder. So I'm not going to draw around this too religiously, not too carefully at all, just in case I change my mind about colours or borders and boundaries, just enough to get the shape of the robin down and to get some of the features in. So I'm obviously concentrating on the orange part, getting that chest in and paying really close attention to the eye, to the highlight in the eye and to his beak shape. So just slowing down a little bit when I get to those parts, and then moving on to the legs. And we're going to have quite the impressionistic robin. So again, we don't need to worry too much about going round him as a silhouette. It's just to show that he has legs, he has those claws, and that he's standing on something. He's standing on the handle of a garden spade. And actually, I'm not going to worry too much about making it look like a garden spade. I'm just going to make it look like he's standing on something. So before I take the trace down away, I'm going to lift that up to check that he's there, which he is. Great news. Take the trace down away and then remove my plain copy just over to one side, and I can see him there. Now, if you're not terribly confident with your drawing, you could go back over it with pencil if you wanted to, but I'm going to incorporate some pen work, and then that means I can wash the watercolour in nice and loosely later. So I've got 3 pens here. Now, as you can see in this copy, he's got some brown on him. He's obviously got a very black beady eye, and he's also got some grey on him. So rather than having one pen, which would look, say for example, you chose the brown, would look great on the brown bits, but wouldn't look so great on his eye, wouldn't look so great on his chest, I've got 3 colours here. So I've got the black for his eye, the brown for his back, and the grey for everything else. So let's start with the black, because the first thing I'm going to put in is going to be this beady eye. So let's put it in. I can look at my photograph to make sure that I've got everything in the right place. It is a little bit tricky because I've made the decision to flip him around, but his eye's still in the same place. So there's his eye going in, and I'm going to use the black for part of his beak. So we'll start with that part of it just there, putting that in. And I'm also going to use the black down on his claws, which I've very roughly drawn in. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 there. And then the back of that one, this part here, and over to the side. So that's me done with the black. Next, I'm going to move on to the brown. So I'm going to use the brown for over the top of his head and back down the length of his body. And then a little bit of attention where his wing is, because we've got a rather nice pattern on his wing. Coming up around here, his tail is also brown. Again, I'm not going to worry too much about it. Let's just put the curve of that wing in. And then the part where the brown meets part of the orange, which comes around his eye. But actually, I'm not going to do any more than that. The grey is the one I really want to concentrate on. So this is the Derwent Graphic Line Maker. Brilliant that they do these in a grey, because it's not as hard as some of the other colours. So I'm coming around onto his chest area, down into here. I can finish off his beak as well, where his beak meets his head. Coming around the back here, and then just putting a little bit of cross-hatching in for those lovely textured feathers, and underneath on this undercarriage. Coming up and around, better put this area in as well, underneath his tail, and putting those legs in. So everything is there, ready for me to paint. A little bit more texture onto his feet, do his feet a little bit more justice. I can even use it on the handle of the spade. There we go. Now all I need to do is to put a background in, and then we can let that dry before we carry on. So I thought I'd go for some nice cold colours, because I want the warmth of his chest to stand out. So I'm going to use Daniel Smith's Cobalt Turquoise, one of my favourite colours. So I'm mixing that up into a nice puddle, ready to go, and then treat it exactly like a watercolour. So some water around the edge, because we're going to paint it like a vignette, so we're painting with soft edges. All the way round, water all the way down, even round where the spade handle is, because this is simply just for background. And then we're going to drop some of this beautiful colour in, right up to him, so you're painting around him negatively, and bringing that little bit of turquoise down. Don't worry too much if the turquoise spills over into him, because we'll make him so much stronger. Using my kitchen roll, now you can start to see where the watercolour ground is really helping the textures and make your background a lot more interesting. This is the best bit though. This is where the Cobalt Turquoise is going over the collage material. So I've got elements of the text and the lyrics coming out. Make sure that I hit that area in between his legs. I'm putting some colour down just in front of his chest, because that's a nice white area. Now don't neglect the rest of your painting. So I still need to have some Cobalt Turquoise down here, just to balance out that composition. Pulling some down to one side of the spade, and using the water to blend it out. And my kitchen roll, if the water starts to get a little bit out of control, or if I want to create that nice soft vignette finish. And actually, I'm rather pleased with that so far. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let that dry fully before I start painting the robin. So let's get this robin painted in. I'm going to do him in watercolours, and because everything is now in place, I can really afford to spend time concentrating on where his lights and darks are. And then if I need to at the end, I can pop some pen back in, but I'll assess it later. So we're going to start off with the brown, and we're going to be using the Daniel Smith burnt umber from that, a lovely rich warm brown. I'm using my number 6 nylon brush here so that it will do some detail, but it's not too small. So looking at my photograph, I'm going to just pop a little bit of brown over the back of his head. Again, I'm trying really hard not to paint every last little item in. Taking some water off and then using what's left on my brush to just blend that out, softening that edge all the time, and you can see that the watercolour is going beautifully over that watercolour ground. Use a little bit of my kitchen roll just to blot out if I need it, and work my way down to his wing. This area is a little darker on the photograph, so I will replicate that by using a stronger colour. Coming around down into this area and using the water again to blend it out. Pushing that colour a little bit further into the tail area. And I'm just going to use some water on the end of his tail just to soften that, so that I'm not particularly describing where his tail stops and starts. Leave it a little bit to the imagination. Now some of that very pale brown also comes into these white feathers here. So I'm just going to introduce a light wash, bringing it around and down the corner, and then hopefully he starts to look a little bit more three-dimensional. Moving on to the nice bright orange chest, which is obviously synonymous with being a robin. I've got Azo yellow, which is very bright and fluorescent, but I want my Christmas card to have a little bit of oomph. I don't want it to be too pale. And I've also got Pyrrole orange, again, a lovely bright colour. And if I want to, I can always incorporate a little bit of the brown with it if I need to dull it down. So I'm going to start off by picking up the yellow on my brush and then straight away dipping it into the orange. This is something that we would call double loading. I'm going to look at where the light and dark areas of my robin are and put in the colour. Now I know that looks strong, but don't worry. That's what the water's for. So we're going to use the water to blend that out around the eye area, and you can see straight away that as soon as the water is introduced, it softens everything, but you've still got a real punch to the robin. So back into the Azo yellow, and again straight into the orange, looking for the next brightest area, which I think is around this part here. Now my pen really kind of foreshortened on this robin, but that's okay. I can just paint straight over the top of it, using the water to pull that colour around into the front area, using a little bit of kitchen roll just to soften that. I'm really happy with that. And that brown that I had mixed up earlier, I'm going to load my brush with the brown straight into the orange, that double loading again, and I can then use that for some of the darker areas here. And it means you're not smashing your watercolour too much around on a palette. If you can pick both of the colours up at the same time, it creates a much softer effect on your painting. That's a little handy hint for you to take into the future. So that colour, that orange colour, the one with a little bit of brown in it, there's also some reflected colour in his undercarriage. So I'm just going to put a tiny amount of orange down and then spread that out. It saves your animal looking like it's kind of a cutout. So use some of the other colours elsewhere. Now onto the grey. So for this, I'm going to go back to the Lunar Black, which I've used previously on this DVD, and I'm going to load my brush up because I know that it's a lovely soft colour. So one of the biggest areas of grey is here, around where the orange meets the brown. So I'm going to pop that in, and I'm going to use the water again to blend that out. Back into the Lunar Black and into this area here. You will find that the watercolour ground accepts the watercolour a little differently to the paper, but if you're painting a natural form, you should find that that helps it rather than hinders it. A little bit more grey. Where's the next bit? Up here, just around the back of his eye area, and a little bit over his head too. Use the brush to blend that out, and then I can really concentrate on his legs. So I'm going to use the grey. They're a little bit pinky actually in this photograph, but rather than introduce a new colour, I'm going to load up with the Lunar Black. Oh, that's a bit strong. Load up with the Lunar Black and touch it into the burnt umber. And then I can paint these leg areas in, giving him slightly too thicker legs. And that's what the point of the brush is going to be for. There we go, that's better. So putting those claws in, making the top area of that leg a little darker. Again, you can see that I'm painting quite impressionistically. Don't worry too much, it will still look like a robin, I promise. And blending that colour out into the undercarriage. Now I do need that grey as well for his beak area. So putting a little bit of colour down, well that's looking better already, and blending that out. And then of course he needs something to stand on. So I'm going to use the brown to tie in with the handle that he's attached to, just to give a really loose wash down here, not to be too prescriptive with it. And you'll see that it starts to knock that collage back as well. Again, let's not worry about straight lines or over painting it. Let's just get something down so it looks like he's standing on an area. Pulling that colour down, make that a little bit stronger where the handle meets the main part. Pulling that colour down. That's as much as I want to do really, otherwise I'll start getting really pernickety with it. And then I can have a look at it and say to myself, well, is it strong enough? Is it bright enough? Has it got enough punch? And I can see that the eye area really needs to be gone back over. So I'm going to use the black pen as I did before, but this time I'm really going to lay down the colour, being really careful to not go over those lovely highlights that I created. I can put some shading into the beak and put a little bit of texture down so that starts to come out. I can go back into those talons, back down here. That looks better already, starting to come out. And then I'm going to switch to the brown, so the same order that I did them in before. I can add a little bit more cross-hatching or texture if I feel it's appropriate. Certainly down his wing, that would be nice. Give him a bit more fluff. Down the tail area, let's put a little bit around his head, not too much. And then onto the grey to work back into this area where the orange meets the rest. So you can build up the layers as you see fit and as befits your own robin. Looking at that undercarriage area. Now he's quite fluffy down here, so let's put some of those lines in too. Hopefully it will look like he's a bit chilly. So working back in, pulling those leg areas back nice and sharp again, and then nicely over the top of the collage now. Now one last little thing, because that orange isn't as bright as I would like it. So just neat, I'm going to be really brave and go in with the Pyrrole orange just on its own. Just add a little bit of punch back into him. And then hopefully whoever receives this Christmas card from me will get a nice surprise. So let's blend that orange out into the other area, use a bit of that transferred colour, and there we have my robin. Now I'm going to finish him off by attaching him to a piece of card, and you'll see how that's done in the bonus feature of the DVD. But there's my robin, all done. So that brings us to the end of the DVD. I really hope that some of the techniques I've shown you will help you to paint your own contemporary Christmas cards.